And these video notes are really going to be pretty much opposite or the converse statements of the previous ones. And that means that if we know first some different relationships between different angles, so between our different types of angles we have, then we can tell that the lines are parallel. So in the previous notes, we knew the lines were parallel and then we could say something about them or the relationship. But now if we know a certain relationship between the angles, then we know then that the two lines will be parallel to each other. So the first one is the converse of the same side interior or consecutive interior angles postulate. And that is if we have two lines that are cut by the transversal so that the pair of those same side interior angles are supplementary, then the lines are going to be parallel to each other. And here is a brief version of what that is. So we know that if the angles are supplementary, then that implies that our lines are going to be parallel to each other. So the converse of the alternate interior angles theorem is if we have two lines with our transversal, or it's cut by the transversal so that those alternate interior angles are congruent to each other, then that implies that our two lines are going to be parallel to each other. And here's our brief explanation of that as well. Then for the third one, our converse of the alternate exterior angles theorem is if we have two lines cut by the transversal so that any pair of alternate exterior angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. Our fourth one then is the converse of the corresponding angles theorem, and that is if we have two lines that are cut by the transversal so that any pair of our corresponding angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel to each other. So there are your four different setups. So it just depends on what the relationship is between the angles, then that tells us that the lines are parallel. So in example 1, we need to use the given angle relationships to decide whether those lines, so line L and M, are parallel to each other, and we have to explain the reasons why. So if 3 and 5 are congruent, that's right there. So they're telling us that they are congruent. So the question is that enough information to tell us that line L and M are parallel to each other? So 3 and 5 are really alternate interior angles. And we know that alternate interior angles implies that the two lines are parallel. This is enough information to say that our lines are going to be parallel. Next is angle 3 and angle 7, and those are corresponding angles. And when corresponding angles are congruent, that implies that we have two lines that are parallel as well. So yes, this is enough information to say that our two lines are parallel. Thirdly, for letter C, 1 and 7 are congruent, and those are alternate exterior angles. And if alternate exterior angles are congruent, then that does imply that we have two lines that are parallel. So this is also going to be a yes. For letter D, we have angles 6 and 8, and 6 and 8 are vertical angles. All that vertical angles tells us is that we have congruent angles, but it does not tell us anything about parallel lines. So this would not have enough information to say that any two lines, or our line L and M, are going to be parallel to each other. If you also notice that these two angles are not even using anything with our line L, so one of the angles has to be in these four clusters, and one of the angles needs to be in these clusters of angles as well. Otherwise, you can't compare the two lines. So angle 3 plus angle 6, so those are in orange. If we add those together, that they equal 180 degrees. So first of all, angle 3 and angle 6 are the same side interior or consecutive interior. And if these angles are supplementary, that is enough to tell us that we have two lines that are going to be parallel to each other. So this last one would be a yes. In example 2, if we use the same picture from up above, and we say that angle 4 and angle 8 are congruent, then they give us some measures for angle 4 and 8, and we want to find the value of x. So first we need to identify the relationship between those two angles, what they are, and then what that tells us. So 4 and 8 are corresponding angles. And if we have corresponding angles that are congruent, then that implies that we have two lines that are parallel to each other. And because they are congruent to each other, that we can set those two angles equal. So we've got x plus 20 equals 2x plus 5. Now if we subtract x from the left and move it to the right, that would give us just a 1x on the right. And then we still have a 20 on the left. If we move our 5 to the left, we have to subtract it, so we'd get 15 on the left, and on the right is our x. So x is equal to 15. Example 3 is here to make you think a little bit. So is it possible for two lines to be cut by a transversal, such as my picture right there, so that the alternate interior angles, that would be right here and right here is an example of them, that with the alternate interior angles are both congruent and supplementary. So automatically we already know that they are congruent, but what would make them supplementary? So the only type of angles that would make them, that would be congruent plus need to add up to equal 180 degrees. That means that if you look at my setup here in orange, we would have that the angles need to be the same, and the only way for that to happen is if they're the same and they equal 180 degrees is if they are both 90 degrees. So if these were both right angles, so really all of these are right angles are going to be perpendicular to each other, that would be the only situation where they would both be congruent and supplementary for those alternate interior angles. On example 4, part A and B, we need to figure out if certain lines are parallel based on our different numbers in our picture. So if we want to find out if M is parallel to N, that's these right here in pink, so we need to use an angle that is off of both of those lines. So we would never be able to use these diagonal ones because then I have these other lines that are created, so I need to use one transversal with the two that we think are parallel. So I'd have to compare the 75 and 68. 68, and know what the type of those angles are. And they are in the same location because they're both in the upper right corner of those different angle intersection points, and those are corresponding angles. If we want parallel lines, we need our corresponding angles to be congruent to each other. Since we do not have congruent corresponding angles, then we are not going to have two parallel lines of M and N. Now we're going to do the same setup to figure out if J is parallel to K. Now remember, we need one transversal line. We could use the line N or we could use the line M, but the M is the only one that it actually has two angles off of it. So we're going to compare the 105 and the 75 degrees. Now those two are on the same side of our transversal line, and they are between the two lines that we think are parallel. So that would be our consecutive, and then it would be interior angles. To have parallel lines, we need to have consecutive interior angles that are supplementary or equal 180 degrees. When we add 105 and 75 together, we do have supplementary angles. So that means that yes, those two lines would be parallel, so J is parallel to K. So those two lines are parallel because our consecutive interior angles are supplementary, and that implies we have two parallel lines. On example 5 for letter A, we need to answer our question. So for AD, so segment AD, to be parallel to segment CB, the value of X must be what? So this would be our transversal line going through it. So you need to make a conclusion based off of our 95 degrees and what type of angles those need to be, and figure out what does the X need to equal to make it so that those two lines are parallel to each other. Those two lines, so AD and CB, if those are parallel, then these two angles would be our consecutive interior angles, and they need to be supplementary. And once we know that they're supplementary, then we can take 180 minus our 95, and that's what our X will equal, and you should have gotten an 85 degrees then for your X. If we want to find out if AC is parallel to DB, we do pretty much the same thing. Here's our transversal line, and then we need to solve for our angle Y, and they would be the same type of angle, so the same reasoning, which means we can take 180 degrees minus your 95, and we would be left with 85 degrees as well. Now for example 6, I want you to set this one up as well and then solve for the X. So you need to figure out what the value of X needs to be so that the horizontal part, so that would be right here, that those would be parallel, and here's your transversal. So you want to look at what type of angles are those, how do you set them up so that we make sure that our lines are going to be parallel to each other. Those two angles are alternate interior angles, and they need to be congruent to each other. you should set the two angles equal to each other as x plus 25 equals 2x. It would be best to move your x to the right, so you would end up with a 1x equals 25. And on that question, that is really then the only step you had to do. On these last two questions, I'm just going to give you what your final answer is in the general setup, so you can go back later and you can solve these if you would like to do more. On this first one, we know that these two angles are consecutive interior angles, and that means that they need to be supplementary to tell us that the two lines are going to be parallel. So supplementary, remember, means angle plus angle equals 180, so we fill in our two angles, so 4x and our 2x plus 12. When you combine your like terms, your 4x and 2x, and then move your 12 over and divide, you get x equals 12 for this first one. For the very last one, we have corresponding angles, and we know that corresponding angles need to be congruent to prove that the two lines will be parallel. We know if it needs to be congruent, we know angle equals angle. So we fill in the 5x and 4x plus 20, set them equal to each other, and then solve for x, and we get x equals 20.